As Deacon Lynn said at the announcements, my name is Jennifer Schulz, and I serve as pastor at Bethlehem Lutheran in Los Alamitos, so not very far from here, maybe I think 6 miles or something like that, depending on which way you travel. So I want to bring you greetings on behalf of the congregation at Bethlehem Lutheran that it is wonderful to be part of this co-op that we've started. I guess the first sermon series we did together was just about a year ago, last fall, or late last summer, early fall, and then of course during Lent this past year, and then Monday, Thursday worship service, and then now this series where the preachers are traveling, moving around from all the different congregations. So I will say this is a pleasure. This is something that I grew up with. Every Lent, the church I grew up with in southern Minnesota, very small rural community, the pastors would have a round robin, and so on Wednesday nights, each of the pastors would travel to the different congregations. So it is a pleasure to be here worshiping with you instead of a recorded sermon like in the past, but to be here in person with you, bringing the good news. And I want to tell you just a little bit about myself that might bring a little light to the sermon, and just a little bit more about myself. As you know, my name is Jennifer. I grew up in Minnesota, as I just said, went to college and seminary there. And the first 20 years of my ministry, I served at 2 different congregations in the Northwest Washington Synod, both congregations in Mount Vernon, Washington, which is about almost in between Seattle and Vancouver, British Columbia. And then I've been at Bethlehem for 8.5 years. This past Monday, I celebrated my 29th anniversary of ordination, and so I've been in the ministry for quite some time now. So grace and peace to you from God, the one who creates, redeems, and sanctifies the world through love and grace. As you already know, today is really the second Sunday in this collaborative sermon series with the co-op churches that we are partnering with. So just a reminder, Christ Lutheran in Long Beach, Bethlehem, Los Alamitos, Our Redeemer, Garden Grove, and Mount Calvary in Cypress. And we're going to be looking at these different gospel readings from chapters 12, 13, and 14 from Luke, a little bit out of order just because of the way that we are traveling around and the way the sermon series has worked itself out. And some of these readings contain parables, like today's reading, often referred to as the parable of the rich fool. Now, I'm going to start off the sermon by saying I don't like this gospel text, for a variety of reasons. I'm sure that's just what you wanted to hear from the pastor, especially a guest pastor that you're maybe meeting for the first time in person at the beginning of a sermon. Well, I'll tell you, I don't like this text for a few reasons that I'll name. It makes me quite uncomfortable. It compounds the guilt that I feel, and I feel so very convicted every single time I either read it or preach on it or hear it. Uncomfortable, guilt-ridden, convicted. All of the kinds of feelings you want to experience when you come to worship, right? Did any of you perhaps experience any of those kinds of things as you heard me read the text today as well? I would imagine that there's at least a few of you gathered here this morning that might feel the same way. Maybe not as strongly as I do, but you maybe experienced it a little bit. Well, at simple face value, I don't like this text because it makes me feel uncomfortable, guilty, and convicted for the manner of life that I live. I have an abundance of possessions, and I'm not lacking for any of the basics of survival. Even just yesterday, a little aside, my sister and her youngest son came down from San Francisco for the weekend. He turned 13 on Friday, so we celebrated by going to Knott's Berry Farm, and then spent most of yesterday shopping. And so I've even added a little bit to my abundance of possessions since I preached last Sunday. So maybe even a little bit guiltier than I was even last week. So I have shelter, I have food, I have clothing, a strong support system, I have good health, and really the list can go on and on and on. And so for many people's eyes, they might think that I have it all, that I have everything. And really, in many ways, that is correct. But even with all of these things that I have, if I'm truly honest, I find myself wanting more, even though I really lack for nothing. I have more than enough, and yet I still want more. Now, I don't think Jesus tells this parable to speak out against simply wanting more or having more, but really speaks to the intention behind it. Jesus doesn't speak out against rich people simply because they're considered rich. I think it goes deeper than that. Now, taking a step back, remember the context of what this parable was even brought up for, why it was brought up in the first place. Jesus was asked to arbitrate between two brothers quarreling over a family inheritance. But Jesus doesn't take sides. Instead, he gives a warning concerning greed and then tells them this parable. It would seem that on the surface, this parable is addressed to those overly concerned about wealth, those who are greedy, and those who only seem to be concerned about how their wealth and greed will affect them and them alone. This is the key, I think, to understanding this parable, and how even though it may still induce feelings that are uncomfortable and guilt-ridden and convicting, I think it still provides some clarity. Recently, there were a group of folks talking about this particular text from Luke, and one of them shared this following thought, a paraphrase quote that he had heard. And this paraphrase is, "If my cup overflows, then my neighbor can have a drink. If my cup overflows, then my neighbor can have a drink." I like the image that this produces. An overflowing cup which we might quickly try to sop up the extra or pour it out into something else for ourselves. But with this, an overflowing cup that is not stopped from overflowing, but one that is shared because it is overflowing. It's a simple and beautiful concept that at times can be challenging to make a reality. This image grants a perspective beyond one's own receiving of something overflowing and provides that same reception to the neighbor. As followers of Christ, we believe and trust that we are to be loving and generous with one another, not just with our resources, our financial means, but also with our gifts, our time, ourselves. We believe and trust this because of the examples that Christ set before us, examples that we still live in today. We may find it easier to make this a reality when it's really done on our terms, according to the choices that we want to make as to who and how we will be loving and generous with. But the real audacious challenge of it is that Jesus doesn't tell us that we should be loving and generous only to the people that we like or the organizations that we agree with. In fact, he actually says quite the opposite in a few places, when he says things like, "Pray for those who persecute you. Love your neighbor, not just your next door neighbor. Love your enemies," and on and on and on. And although none of those specific things that I just referenced are referred to in today's text, I think there's a strong implication when Jesus directs the meaning of the parable to being rich, not toward oneself, but toward God. And I think the further implication is that God is rich toward us, and we are to be rich toward one another. So how can any of us, move beyond the uncomfortable, guilt-ridden, convicted feelings that this text produces? Or perhaps more difficult yet, how is one affected by this text if they don't feel at all uncomfortable or guilty or convicted? If they can't see or comprehend what Jesus is saying and how it not only affects our relationship with God, but also with one another. I think Jesus' point in telling this parable is to redirect one's ambitions of what it means to be rich. I think for many years, and perhaps especially in the United States of America, and honestly I can't speak to anything else because this is the only place I've really lived, but I think when considering this, when we think about someone who is rich, we think automatically of terms of wealth or possessions, usually monetary, financial. But what about being rich in other things, the material possessions? When considering this, I was reminded of one of my uncle's wedding toast to his daughter when she was married a few years ago. I should also mention that my father and two of my uncles are all now retired Lutheran pastors, so it kind of runs in the family in that way. But my uncle, Richard, at his daughter's wedding a few years ago, quoted a poem that spoke about being rich in daughters. And I love that thought. It's a whole new definition of what it means to be rich. And then I started to think about other things that you could be rich in. Rich in family, rich in grace, rich in conversations, rich in mercy, rich in relationships, rich in love, rich in laughter, rich in memories. What if we were really to live in a redefinition of what it means to be rich? How might the kingdom of God reflect these new definitions of what it means to be considered rich? Would the kingdom of God and the people of God truly be enriched? Enriched at the idea of expanding the definition of being rich, therefore expanding how we can enrich one another's lives and how God enriches our lives? I think that would be something. The bulletin cover from last week, really showed a picture of what looks like Costco, honestly, Costco or Sam's Club. You know, tall shelving units with lots of big supplies on it. We're all probably familiar with it. And of course, the quote that often gets lifted up from this text, verse 15, life does not consist in the abundance of possessions, was on the cover of that bulletin. Well, we know this to be true. We know that life does not consist only in the abundance of possessions. We know this both at the surface level and even at a much deeper level down in our hearts. There are many sayings that emphasize this fact. One you're probably familiar with is, you can't take it with you when you die. And of course, there are others like it. The author of one of the biblical commentaries about this text that I read offered the following reflection in his experiences of being with people who were nearing the end of their life. He never once heard anyone say, "I wish I hadn't given so much away," or "I wish I hadn't shared so much." There may be many regrets that one has toward the end of their life, but may sharing ourselves, our time, and our possessions not be one of them. That we can enrich our lives and the lives of others, those known and unknown to us, by being rich towards them. The overflowing cup image comes to mind again. How might we be rich toward our neighbor, and then how might we be enriched by our neighbor? How might we share our overflowing cup with one another, and how might we receive our neighbor's overflowing cup? I want to give you just one suggestion. a practical one that you could perhaps incorporate into your week, or maybe later today or in the days ahead. I invite you to take some intentional time to write a note, make a phone call, have a face-to-face conversation with someone you've been meaning to contact, with no agenda, no asking for anything except for some time, giving of your time and asking for their time. And take that time to share your overflowing cup. Share not as in feeling obligated to bring something, but really sharing of your time, your heart, your conversation, yourself. A precious memory may be made, and the idea of giving of yourself and being rich toward God as you are being rich toward one another then takes on flesh in your shared voices and smiles, and the overflowing cup is being shared. I invite you to consider taking the step and then reflect then how you felt. And perhaps, just maybe, the idea of being rich toward one another might take on a small new understanding. And if I'm being honest, even still at the end of the sermon, now preaching it twice, 2 weeks in a row, I still may not like this text from Luke. It still makes me squirm a bit. I feel uncomfortable and guilty and definitely convicted because of the many riches that I enjoy. Yet I've also been gifted a new way of understanding what it means to be rich toward God as I am rich toward my neighbor. May we all have many opportunities to share and drink from one another's overflowing cup.